My husband found out I was pregnant and said, "That baby isn't mine," and put me out on the street that same night. I slept in a Waffle House parking lot with my seat reclined and my coat as a blanket. The next morning, a lawyer called. "Ma'am, your late husband from 10 years ago left you a fortune, $4.8 million. But there's one condition. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. People say a marriage doesn't end in a single night. They say it dies slowly, in the missed phone calls, in the way a man starts checking his watch before you've even finished your sentence, in the silence that settles over a dinner table like dust on furniture nobody uses anymore. Maybe that's true for most people. But I can tell you exactly which night mine ended, down to the hour, because that's the night I found out my husband had been counting down to something for months, and I was the thing standing in his way. My name is Grace Delaney. For 5 years I was married to a man named Nathan Delaney, and we lived in a stone and cedar house in Myers Park, one of those old, leafy neighborhoods in Charlotte, North Carolina, where the trees are older than the houses, and the houses are older than most marriages. I was a landscape architect. I designed gardens, courtyards, the bones underneath the beauty, drainage, grading, root systems, the quiet mechanics that keep a living thing from collapsing in on itself during the first hard storm. Nathan worked in private equity, structuring deals for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of job that comes with a corner view and a calendar nobody else is allowed to see. On the surface, we were the couple other people used as a measuring stick. Look how well they've done. Look how easy they make it look. But I design gardens for a living, and I know better than almost anyone that what looks effortless above the soil is usually just very well hidden work below it. What I didn't understand, not for a long time, was that Nathan had been doing quiet work of his own, and none of it was for us. The first thing I noticed, almost a year before everything came apart, was that Nathan had started taking calls in the garage. I remember the exact evening. I'd come home late from a site walkthrough, headlights swinging into the driveway around 8, and I found him standing between the lawnmower and a stack of paint cans, phone pressed so hard to his ear his knuckles had gone pale. He saw me and held up one finger. "Give me a second." When he came inside 10 minutes later, he kissed my temple and said it was a difficult client, a deal that kept falling apart and reassembling itself at odd hours. I believed him, because 5 years of marriage teaches you to believe the easiest explanation, the one that lets you keep eating your dinner in peace. Then there was the money. Nathan managed our joint account. I'd agreed to that early on, back when his job had more predictable hours than mine, back when it made sense for someone to be the one paying bills and reconciling statements. Around the same time the garage calls started, I began noticing withdrawals. Small ones. 150 here, 200 there, always in cash, always on a Wednesday or a Thursday. When I finally asked him about it over takeout one night, he gave me that easy, unbothered smile of his and said he'd been buying gifts, taking a colleague to lunch who just lost her father, the usual small kindnesses that don't make it into a budget. I let it go, the way you let go of a stone in your shoe when you're already running late. And then Nathan started asking about Owen. Owen Marsh had been my first husband. We married when I was 23 and he was 28, both of us broke and ambitious and certain we were building something permanent. We divorced 4 years later, not from any single catastrophic event, but from the slow discovery that we wanted different shapes for our lives. He wanted to build software companies in Seattle rain. I wanted to grow gardens in Carolina heat. There was no bitterness in it, just two people quietly admitting they'd taken a wrong turn together. We had no children. He moved west, started a company that built energy monitoring software for commercial buildings, and I hadn't spoken to him in almost a decade. So when Nathan began mentioning him, "Whatever happened to that first husband of yours, the software guy?" I assumed it was garden-variety curiosity, maybe a flicker of old-fashioned jealousy. He asked 4 separate times over 2 months, always dressed differently. A joke over wine, a stray comment while we watched the news, a question folded inside another question about my 20s. I filed it away as something to bring up in couples counseling someday, the way you file away a hairline crack in a foundation you assume is settling normally. I was 9 weeks pregnant the night my whole life came apart. I'd taken 3 home tests over 5 days before I let myself believe it, then confirmed it with my doctor on a Monday morning. We hadn't been trying exactly, but we hadn't been careful either, and I had let myself assume, foolishly, that Nathan and I were standing on the same ground about wanting a family. I came home that Tuesday with a small paper bag from a boutique downtown, a soft gray onesie that said Future Landscape Architect stitched across the front, the ultrasound photo tucked beneath tissue paper like something fragile enough to bruise. I remember every second of what happened next, the way you remember a car accident in slow motion, even though it took 4 seconds total. Nathan opened the bag. He looked at the onesie. He looked at the photograph. He set both down on the kitchen island with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who had already made a decision and was only now performing the moment of discovering it. Then he looked at me, and something in his face had gone flat and cold in a way I had never seen in 5 years of marriage, and he said the words I will hear for the rest of my life. "That baby isn't mine." I laughed. I actually laughed because some animal part of my brain refused to believe he meant it. But his expression didn't move. He said it again, slower, like he wanted the words to land with more weight the second time. He said he'd suspected for months that I'd been unfaithful. He said he wanted me out of the house that night, immediately, before he had to look at me across another meal. When I stepped toward him, reaching for his arm, he stepped back like I was something contagious. By 9:30, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of an all-night Waffle House 2 miles from the only home I'd known for 5 years, the little gray onesie still folded in its paper bag on the passenger seat, and no idea what had just happened to my life. I sat there a long time in the dark before I let myself cry, and I asked myself one question over and over, turning it like a stone in my palm. What kind of man, married 5 years, hears his wife is pregnant and reaches instantly, without hesitation, for absolute certainty that the child isn't his? That isn't jealousy. That isn't insecurity. That's a man who has already decided, ahead of time, that he needs a reason. I didn't have the answer yet, but somewhere in the cold, quiet back of my mind, a small, steady part of me had already started looking for one. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I sat in the driver's seat with the heater running because March in Charlotte can turn cold and mean after sundown, and I did what I do for a living. I started assessing the ground I was actually standing on. I had about $600 in a personal checking account I rarely used. My laptop, my drafting tablet, 3 active client files, and 8 years of design archives were all sitting inside a house I no longer had a key I trusted. My health insurance ran through Nathan's employer plan because 2 years earlier, when I'd gone independent for 6 months, it had been simpler to stay on his coverage than set up my own. I was 9 weeks pregnant with no accessible income, no separate insurance, and a husband who had just told me, in front of a onesie and an ultrasound photo, that I was on my own. And somewhere underneath all of that, quietly, I understood something else. I might be sitting on information Nathan had been counting on me, never putting together. I pulled out my phone in that Waffle House parking lot and did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I searched Owen Marsh's name. His company, a Seattle firm that built energy monitoring software for commercial real estate portfolios, had been acquired 18 months earlier by a much larger infrastructure firm, one whose name I recognized from Nathan's own industry chatter at dinner parties. The purchase price hadn't been made public. But firms like that don't buy small, and companies like Owen's don't sell quietly unless somebody very deliberate is managing the story. His LinkedIn hadn't updated since the acquisition closed. There were no new interviews, no press, nothing. Just silence, the deliberate kind. I sat with my phone glowing in the dark and asked myself what Nathan knew that I didn't, and how long he'd known it. Around 5 in the morning I drove to a 24-hour diner on South Boulevard and ordered coffee and toast I barely touched. By the time the sun came up over the parking lot, I had the outline of something that wasn't a plan yet, but was at least a shape. First, I needed to get back into that house for my documents. My passport, my license, my laptop, the backup drive with 8 years of project files. Those were mine, and Nathan couldn't legally keep me from them, though I knew him well enough to know he'd try. Second, I needed a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. Someone who could tell me where I actually stood financially, and whether Nathan could legally freeze me out of a house that carried both our names on the mortgage. Third, I needed to see a doctor of my own, quickly, before my coverage disappeared out from under me. And fourth, the part of the list that made my hands go still around my coffee cup, I needed to find out exactly what Nathan knew about Owen, and why a man who had never once mentioned my first husband in 5 years of marriage had suddenly needed to know everything about him. Because if Nathan had been quietly tracking my ex-husband's business for months, then his accusation the night before hadn't been a moment of panic. It had been a plan, and the only reason to invent an affair and throw a pregnant woman out of her own house is if you need her gone, cleanly on paper, as someone else's fault, before something happens that would otherwise entitle her to more than you're willing to share. I left $3 on the table and walked out into a cold Charlotte morning feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all. Steady, not safe, not happy, steady, the way a slope holds after you've finally found the right angle for the retaining wall. I knew what I was standing on now. I pulled up my contacts and found the number of Renee Coyle, a family law attorney I'd met twice through a mutual client, a woman who'd once asked my opinion on regrading her office courtyard. It was barely 7 in the morning. I texted her anyway. "Renee, it's Grace Delaney. I need to see you today if at all possible. Family emergency." Her reply came 9 minutes later. "Come in at 8:30. Don't eat breakfast. We'll be a while." Renee Coyle's office sat on the 9th floor of a glass building uptown, the kind of place I'd driven past 100 times without ever going inside. Her assistant met me in the lobby and walked me to a small conference room that smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. I was wearing yesterday's clothes. I'd stopped at a drugstore for a travel toothbrush and a clean shirt, and that was as far as I'd managed. Renee came in exactly on time, set a legal pad on the table, and looked at me with the calm, unhurried expression of a woman who had heard a great many terrible things in that room and learned to meet all of them the same way. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Don't skip anything, even the parts that feel embarrassing." I told her everything. She wrote without interrupting. When I finished, 20 minutes later, she set down her pen and folded her hands. "Let's start with what we can fix today," she said. "The house is on both your names." "Yes." "Then he cannot legally change the locks or bar you from entering. If he's already done it, that's a straightforward civil matter and we move fast. Second, has he touched the joint account since last night?" I didn't know. She slid her phone across the table. "Check now." I logged into the account. 2 days earlier it had held just over $19,000. The balance now read $412. I set the phone down. My hand, oddly, was completely steady. "He moved it," I said. Renee's expression didn't change, but her pen did. "Timestamps." I checked. 3 transfers, all made between 10 and 11 the previous night, less than an hour after he'd put me out, into an account I didn't recognize. "That's dissipation of marital assets," Renee said, writing quickly. "It gives us grounds to move for an emergency order freezing any further transfers." "How long have you two been married?" 5 years. "North Carolina the whole time?" "Yes." "Then this is an equitable distribution state, and moving money out from under you the same night he throws you out is not going to play well in front of a judge." She looked up. "Now tell me about your first husband." I told her what little I knew and what I'd found at 4 a.m. in a Waffle House parking lot. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd listened to everything else. You think your current husband found out something about your ex-husband's finances and moved to get you out of the picture before whatever it is materialized, she said flatly. I think it's possible. I think it's the only theory that actually explains last night, she said. I want you to do 2 things today. First, contact the state bar's referral service and ask for an estate attorney who handles inheritance disputes, someone who can find out, formally, whether Owen Marsh left you anything. Second, start a paper trail. Every text, every voicemail, every bank statement you can still access. Send it all to an email account Nathan doesn't know exists. I had one, an old account from before we married, one I hadn't touched in years. I nodded, already writing. And Grace, she said as I stood to leave, document everything from this point forward like your future depends on it. Because right now it does. I left her office a little after 10 with a folder of intake forms and something I hadn't had in 12 hours direction. The Charlotte morning had turned bright and hard-edged, the kind of clear late winter light that makes everything look more survivable than it actually is. I sat in my car in the parking deck and worked through Renee's list methodically. I screenshotted the bank statements and sent them to my old email. I photographed the transfer timestamps. I emailed the joint accounts bank, flagging the transfers as unauthorized and requesting a hold, using language Renee had dictated word for word. Then I called Owen's family. I hadn't spoken to any of them in a decade, but I remembered his younger sister, Nora, who had always been kind to me, even after the divorce, in that quiet way some people manage without making it awkward. I found her on social media, same warm face, a little older now, and sent a short message explaining who I was and that I had reason to believe I might need to reach someone regarding Owen's estate. I said I was sorry to intrude this way. I said I hoped she was well. She called back within the hour. Her voice was careful, gentle, the kind of gentle that tells you something before the words do. Grace, she said, Owen died 14 months ago. It was his heart. Nobody saw it coming. He was 44. A pause. His attorneys have been trying to reach you for months. How did you not know? I told her I'd had no idea. I told her my life had changed very suddenly in the last 12 hours, and that I didn't fully understand why yet. She was quiet for a moment. He never remarried, she said. He talked about you sometimes, especially near the end. He always said you were the one person in his life who'd never once asked him for anything. Another pause. His attorney's name is Walter Higgins. He's in Seattle. Grace, you need to call him today. I sat in that parking deck for a long time after we hung up. Owen was gone. He'd been gone over a year, and his attorneys had been quietly trying to find me the entire time. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence, Nathan had found out something I hadn't even known to look for. The shape of the last few months rearranged itself in my mind all at once. The garage calls, the cash withdrawals, the casual questions about Owen, the accusation that had come the same night I told him I was pregnant, the money emptied from our account within the hour. Nathan hadn't suspected anything about an affair. He'd known about Owen. He'd known for months, and he had been calculating, quietly, patiently, the way he structured every deal at work, until the pregnancy threatened to complicate a timeline he'd already set in motion, and he panicked into moving faster and messier than he'd planned. I called Walter Higgins's office in Seattle. His assistant put me on hold for 3 minutes. When Walter came on the line, his voice carried a mixture of professional caution and something that sounded almost like relief. "Mrs. Delaney," he said, "I'm very glad you finally called. There is a matter of considerable importance regarding the estate of Owen Marsh, and you are a named beneficiary." "How considerable?" I asked. $4.8 million, he said. "Though I should tell you, there is one condition attached, and it matters quite a lot right now given what you've just described about your marriage." $4.8 million. I sat with those words in a parking deck in uptown Charlotte, watching a concrete pillar with a faded number 3 painted on it, as if the universe had decided to give me something plain and solid to look at while my entire understanding of my life rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Walter explained the estate carefully. Owen had restructured his holdings after the company's sale, proceeds from the acquisition, a modest portfolio of investments, a house in Seattle he'd never sold. Most of it had been consolidated into an irrevocable trust roughly a year before he died, naming me as primary beneficiary, with a clause that had struck even his own attorney as unusual at the time he drafted it. Owen built in what our office calls a rapid response provision, Walter explained. If, at any point, credible evidence emerged that you were experiencing a sudden housing or financial emergency, documentation like a police report, an emergency legal filing, evidence you've been abruptly displaced from your residence, an initial disbursement would release automatically within 24 hours without requiring you to travel or appear in person first. He told me, and I remember this conversation clearly, that he never wanted you to be stuck somewhere unsafe waiting on paperwork. The full estate requires additional steps to finalize, but the emergency provision is designed to move fast. And the condition? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. To retain the funds as your separate, protected property rather than have them absorbed into any marital estate. You need to formally establish legal separation from your current husband within 90 days of the initial disbursement, Walter said. Owen structured it that way deliberately. If you reconcile with your husband before the separation is finalized, the trust treats the funds as commingled, and depending on your state's laws, a portion could become subject to equitable distribution regardless of the trust language. He wanted this money to be yours, entirely yours, not leverage for anyone else's benefit. I understood, sitting there, why Renee had asked me so carefully about timelines that morning. The 90 days weren't just a legal formality. They were a countdown, and somewhere out there, Nathan and his mother were about to become very interested in whether I reconciled with him or not. The initial disbursement, Walter continued, given your circumstances as you've described them, should process tonight. You'll want to have a separate account ready by morning. I called Renee immediately and told her everything. She was quiet on the other end for a moment, and then she said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her yet, something close to admiration. Your first husband, she said, was either the most thoughtful man I've never met or the most strategic, possibly both. Open a new account today, Grace. Today. I did. I drove straight from the parking deck to a bank branch I'd never used before, one with no connection to Nathan, and opened a checking account in my name alone. I sat in the car afterward and stared at the empty balance, feeling the strange vertigo of knowing something enormous was coming and having absolutely no proof of it yet. The money hit the next morning. I was sitting at my friend Priya's kitchen table. She'd handed me a spare key within an hour of my calling her the night before, no questions asked. Just stay as long as you need, when the notification came through on my phone. $4,800,000 deposited overnight. I stared at the number until it stopped looking real and started looking like a typo. Priya, reading my face from across the table, came around and looked over my shoulder and then sat down very slowly in the chair beside me. Grace, she said, what is happening? I told her everything, start to finish, the way I'd told Renee. When I got to the part about the 90-day condition, Priya's expression sharpened into something focused and protective. So whatever they're planning next, she said, it's going to be about getting you back under the same roof as him before those 90 days are up. I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but the second she said it, I knew she was right. Priya had been my closest friend since graduate school, back when we bonded over identical opinions about badly designed public parks and terrible coffee. She was blunt, funny, and loyal in the specific way that doesn't announce itself in speeches. It just shows up with a spare key and doesn't ask questions it doesn't need answered yet. Her spare room became mine for the next several weeks, and her kitchen table became the place where I spread out documents, made calls, and slowly rebuilt something that felt like solid ground. Renee filed for the emergency asset freeze the same afternoon the money arrived, and a judge granted it within 48 hours, locking down what remained of the joint account and putting Nathan on formal notice that further transfers would constitute contempt. She also sent his attorney a letter establishing my right to retrieve my personal property from the house, and 2 days later, a deputy accompanied me while I collected my laptop, my documents, and 3 boxes of client files. Nathan stood in the kitchen doorway the entire time, watching me carry things out with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not even contempt, but a kind of cold, careful arithmetic, like a man recalculating a spreadsheet in real time. His mother, Vivian, was seated at the kitchen table, hands folded neatly in front of her, eyes tracking every box. Vivian Delaney was 68, precise and silver-haired, with the warm, grandmotherly manner of a woman who had spent her whole life using warmth as currency. I'd never liked her, and I'd known from our very first Thanksgiving that she'd never liked me either, though she was too controlled to ever show it directly. It came out in small calibrations, a slightly too surprised tone when I described my work, a habit of finishing Nathan's sentences before he could finish them himself. She was, I had come to understand over 5 years, the quiet architecture behind much of how Nathan thought. He was sharp, but he was the kind of sharp that needed sharpening by someone else, and Vivian had been doing that work for him his entire life. As I carried out my last box, she spoke for the first time. "You're making a very serious mistake, Grace," she said pleasantly, as though offering advice about seasoning a roast. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. I flew to Seattle the following week to begin the formal claims process with Walter Higgins's office, which occupied 2 floors of a glass building overlooking the water. His paralegal offered me coffee with the careful, practiced courtesy of people who know exactly how large a number they're dealing with. The process took most of a day: identity verification, review of the trust documents, formal attestation of my prior marriage and divorce from Owen. Walter walked me through every page himself. The rapid response provision released the initial $4.8 million as designed, he explained. The remainder of the estate, additional real estate holdings, and a smaller investment portfolio will disperse in stages over the next year as those assets are liquidated in an orderly way. But Grace, I want to be direct with you about something. Owen updated this trust 8 months before he passed. You were named from the very first draft, years ago, back when the 2 of you were still married, honestly, before either of you could have known this money would ever exist. But the final revision, the one with the rapid response clause, was written after. After what? I asked. Walter hesitated, the way careful people hesitate before saying something they know will matter. After he asked a mutual acquaintance, casually, whether anyone had heard how your second marriage was going, he said. I don't know what he was told, but something prompted him to add that provision specifically, and specifically worded around housing displacement. I think, in his own way, he was trying to look out for you from a distance, even after everything. I sat with that for a long moment, looking out over the water. Owen, for 1,000 miles away, building software and living a quiet life I knew nothing about, had somehow sensed enough to build me an emergency exit years before I needed one. I didn't cry in that office, but it was close. I flew back to Charlotte on a Friday night. On Saturday morning, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. A man's voice, calm and a little too casual, said, "Grace, I'm a friend of Nathan's. Just want to give you a courtesy heads up. People who go after a man's reputation the way you're going after Nathan sometimes find their own professional life gets complicated. You're licensed with the State Landscape Architecture Board, aren't you? Licenses get reviewed. Complaints get filed. Might be worth thinking hard about whether this is really the road you want to be on." I stood in Priya's kitchen, phone against my ear, and felt something in me go very still and very clear. "I'm recording this call," I said. "Tell me your name." The line went dead. I called Renee, and then I called Walter, and both of them told me the same thing. An intimidation call, made to a cell phone at the direction of an opposing party in active litigation, was serious legal exposure, especially with a professional license explicitly threatened. My carrier had already logged the metadata automatically. Renee filed a harassment motion the following Monday. By Wednesday, Nathan's attorney, a man named Gregory Voss, called Renee's office asking to discuss what he called a more constructive path forward. Renee called me afterward, and I could hear something like satisfaction under her professional calm. "They didn't expect you to already have representation lined up," she said. "They expected you to be scrambling and desperate. You're neither. They're going to try something else," I said. "Rest for a few days first," she told me. "Eat something. Sleep if you can. You're going to need it for what's coming." So I did, for a little while. I walked in Freedom Park most mornings, bought soup from a place near Priya's apartment, and let my body do the quiet, patient work of growing another person inside it. My first prenatal appointment under my own insurance, set up quickly with Renee's help, showed a strong heartbeat and everything exactly where it needed to be. I sat in the parking lot afterward and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to peace. It didn't last long, but it was real while it lasted. The next move came 11 days after the harassment motion was filed. Gregory Voss sent a formal letter proposing mediation, and attached to it, in what I understood immediately was not a coincidence, was a settlement offer. Nathan would agree not to contest the divorce, would drop any claim on the frozen joint account, and would, the letter said, generously agree not to challenge my separate property designation on the Seattle inheritance. In exchange, I would drop the harassment complaint, accept a reduced share of whatever marital assets remained, and sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from ever discussing the circumstances of our separation with any third party. I read it twice and called Renee immediately. "He's trying to buy your silence," she said, before I'd even finished summarizing it. "The NDA is the entire point of that letter. He doesn't actually care about splitting a joint account that's already frozen and mostly empty. He cares about what you know, and what you might say publicly about how he found out about Owen's estate and what he did with that information. About him researching Owen's business for months before he threw me out," I said. "Exactly that," Renee said. "If that pattern of conduct becomes part of a public divorce record, it's professionally and socially damaging for a man in his line of work. Private equity runs on reputation and trust. He can survive an ugly divorce. He can't survive one that makes clients wonder what else he's capable of hiding." "So we decline," I said. "We decline," she agreed. "And we don't counter. A counteroffer signals you're negotiating toward a middle ground. You're not. You want a full accounting on the record. I won't pretend the offer didn't tempt some tired, frightened version of me. There's a version of a person, pregnant, displaced, sleeping in someone else's spare room, uncertain what the next year held, who looks at a settlement number and thinks, what if this is simply enough? What if you signed the paper and disappeared somewhere quiet and let it all go?" I sat with that version of myself for the better part of an hour one rainy afternoon on Priya's couch, a mug of tea going cold in my hands. And then I set it aside because the offer wasn't designed to help me. It was designed to protect Nathan, and more specifically, I suspected, to protect Vivian, because whatever research had gone into tracking Owen's estate over the past year hadn't been done by a man who spent 60-hour weeks at a private equity firm. It had been done by someone with time, patience, and a personal stake in the outcome. I remembered Vivian at that kitchen table, hands folded, eyes tracking every box I carried out. I called Nora Marsh and asked her one careful question. Had anyone, in the year and a half since Owen died, contacted her or anyone in his family asking about his estate or about me? She was quiet for a moment. "A woman called about 8 months ago," she said finally. Said she was writing a piece on tech acquisitions for a business publication, asked whether Owen had left any significant bequests to anyone outside his immediate family. I didn't think much of it at the time. I told her I didn't know the details. A pause. She had a Charlotte area code. That was enough. That evening, I told Priya everything over dinner: the settlement offer, the threatening call, Nora's information about the woman posing as a journalist. Priya listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she set down her fork. So Vivian found out about the inheritance before Nathan ever threw you out, she said slowly. And the plan was to get you out of the marriage before the estate settled, so you'd have no spousal claim to it, except you were already the direct beneficiary, so that part of the plan never made sense to begin with. I think they miscalculated the scale of it, I said. I think they assumed Owen had left me something modest, or that it would default to his own family. I don't think they knew it was anywhere close to $5 million. So they panicked once they figured it out, Priya said. And then you got pregnant, which sped up whatever timeline they've been working on. That's my read on it too, I said. She was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly on the table. What do you need from me? A witness, maybe, I said. At some point. Someone who can speak to my circumstances when I first showed up on your doorstep. The timeline matters. Done, she said, without a second of hesitation. Don't thank me. Somewhere across the city, they're watching to see what you do next, and I'd like them to be disappointed. She was right. Their next move wasn't a letter. It was a visit. Vivian came first, alone, which I recognized immediately as deliberate strategy. She called Priya's number, which I hadn't given her, meaning Nathan had found it somehow, and asked, with a politeness I'd never once heard her use with me, whether she might come by just to talk. I thought about it for a long moment and said yes, because refusing would give her nothing to work with, while letting her come would give me information. She arrived carrying a small tin of homemade shortbread, an offering so precisely calibrated to project harmlessness that I almost admired the craftsmanship of it. She sat in Priya's living room, declined tea, and let her eyes drift around the apartment with the quiet, cataloging attention of someone taking inventory without appearing to. I want to apologize for Nathan, she said. He's been under enormous stress at work, and when you told him about the pregnancy, he simply reacted badly. He knows that now. He's devastated, Grace, truly. I said nothing. This doesn't have to be what it's become, she went on, her hands folded neatly in her lap. 5 years together, and now a baby coming. A baby needs its father in the home, a whole family around it. Think carefully about what you're doing to that child by pursuing all of this the way you are. There it was, precise and quiet and perfectly aimed. And the inheritance, I said. A half-second pause. So brief I would have missed it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that. That's an entirely separate, private family matter, she said smoothly. It has nothing to do with your marriage. Vivian, I said. Who called Owen's sister pretending to be a journalist? Something moved across her face, there and gone in under a second, quick and involuntary. I have no idea what you're referring to, she said. I think you do, I said. She reset almost instantly, the warmth sliding back into place like a mask clicking shut. Grace, I'm asking you, as the grandmother of your unborn child, to stop and think about what you're about to destroy. Nathan is willing to go to counseling. He's willing to start over. All he's asking is that you set the other matter aside. He wants me to drop the harassment complaint and sign an NDA, I said. He wants his wife back, she said. I looked at her for a long moment, 68 years old, silver hair, a tin of shortbread sitting untouched on the coffee table between us. A woman who had spent decades understanding that warmth, deployed correctly, could function as a weapon. That patience was simply another form of control, that being the reasonable one in the room was often the most effective position of all. Vivian, I said, standing. I know about the money moved out of the account the same night Nathan threw me out. I know about the research into Owen's estate. I know about the call to Nora Marsh. My attorney knows all of it, and a judge has already granted an order recognizing that Nathan dissipated marital assets in bad faith. I walked to the door and opened it. Tell Nathan the answer is no. It was always going to be no. And tell him that if anyone contacts my friends, my attorney, or my doctor's office again, will be filing additional motions before the week is over. Whatever warmth had been sitting on Vivian's face vanished immediately, not gradually, like a light switching off. What remained underneath was something colder, drier, entirely calculating. She stood, picked up her tin of shortbread, and walked to the door, and there she turned and said something I hadn't expected. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, in a flat voice with no warmth left in it at all. It wasn't delivered like a threat. It was delivered like a simple statement of fact. She left. I stood in Priya's living room after the door closed and noticed my hands were shaking slightly, not entirely from fear, or not only fear, but from the physical release of sustained control, the way your body lets go of what your face wasn't allowed to show while someone was watching. I was afraid. I won't pretend otherwise. Vivian Delaney was not a woman who made idle threats, and she had resources, social standing, and decades of practiced influence behind her. But the fear didn't make me want to retreat. It made me want to finish what I'd started. I thought of something my grandfather, a civil engineer, used to tell me when I was small and just beginning to understand what he did for a living. "Grace," he'd say, "nothing fails that was actually built to carry its real load. It only fails when someone guessed wrong about what the load would be." I had been underestimated my entire adult life by people who assumed patience meant weakness. Vivian had made the same mistake Nathan had made. I called Renee and told her everything about Vivian's visit. I'd recorded it on my phone, which is legal in North Carolina with one party's consent. Renee listened to the playback in silence and said, when it ended, one quiet word, "Perfect." I sat down that night with the notebook I'd started keeping and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "They are afraid. Fear is useful." And I underlined it twice. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in late spring. Renee had filed for discovery weeks earlier, requesting financial records, phone logs, and digital communications going back 2 years, and Gregory Voss had objected to nearly all of it, and the judge had overruled almost every objection. What emerged from the documents, by the time we sat down in that conference room, was thorough and, by then, unsurprising. Nathan had first searched Owen Marsh's name in a company database the previous spring. The search was logged on his work laptop, which his own attorney had fought unsuccessfully to keep out of discovery. He'd visited the acquisition firm's press page, Owen's dormant LinkedIn profile, and the public information page of a Seattle estate planning firm describing, in general terms, exactly the kind of trust Owen had used. Vivian's phone records, obtained through a subpoena Renee had fought 3 weeks for, showed a 19-minute call to a number registered to Nora Marsh 8 months earlier, the call Nora had already described to me. The same records showed 14 calls between Vivian and Nathan in the 72 hours before he threw me out. And there was an email sent from Nathan's personal account to Gregory Voss's private address in which Nathan wrote, in plain, careless language, that he needed the situation handled before the Seattle attorneys made contact with her. The email was dated 4 days before the night he put me out of our house. He had known. He had planned it. The deposition took place in Renee's own conference room, the same room where she'd once slid her phone across a table and told me to check the joint account balance. 4 months had passed since that morning, and everything about my life had changed. Nathan sat across from me for the first time since that Tuesday night in our kitchen, wearing a navy suit and the composed, over-rehearsed stillness of a man who'd been coached extensively on how to appear calm. For the first 40 minutes, the questions were procedural, and Nathan answered in the practiced cadence of a man reciting prepared lines, leaning heavily on "I don't recall." Then Renee reached the email. She printed it full size on a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table without a word, the way a card player finally lays down the hand they've been holding all along. Nathan looked at it, and something shifted in his posture, barely visible, but I'd spent 5 years learning exactly how to read it. "Mr. Delaney, do you recognize this email? It appears to be from my account. Did you write it?" "I may have." The email refers to the Seattle attorneys making contact with her. "Who is she referring to?" Gregory Voss objected. Renee rephrased. "Mr. Delaney, were you aware, prior to the night you asked your wife to leave your home, that she was a named beneficiary in Owen Marsh's estate?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds. I counted every one of them. "I had information suggesting there might be, yes," he said finally. "Or no, Mr. Delaney," Renee said pleasantly. Gregory Voss put a hand on Nathan's arm and murmured something. Nathan said, "I declined to answer further on that point," and Renee simply nodded and noted for the record that the refusal had been logged. Nathan glanced at his attorney, a look that carried an entire silent conversation inside it, and I watched, in real time, the exact moment he understood that everything he'd built to protect himself had already failed. It didn't collapse dramatically. It settled, the way a structure settles once a single load-bearing element finally gives way, slowly, and then all at once. He looked at me across the table. I had wondered, in the weeks leading up to that moment, what I would feel when it finally arrived: satisfaction, anger, some tangled combination of both. What I actually felt was neither. What I felt was the clear, weightless calm of a person standing inside a structure she designed herself, knowing exactly which walls would hold and which never mattered in the first place. I held his gaze until he looked away first. In the elevator afterward, Renee said, "He'll settle before this ever reaches a judge." "I know," I said. The doors opened onto a bright spring afternoon, that particular Charlotte light that makes the whole city look, for a moment, like it's finally done apologizing for winter. "How are you doing?" Renee asked. I thought about it honestly. My back ached. I was tired in a way that lived somewhere deeper than sleep could fix. I missed having a home that felt entirely mine. And I was also, in a way I hadn't quite expected yet, no longer afraid. "I'm okay," I said. "I'm actually okay." Nathan settled 9 days after the deposition. He had, by that point, very little choice left. The final agreement ran 22 pages. Nathan relinquished all claims to Owen's estate permanently, formally acknowledged it as my separate property, and repaid the full $19,000 he transferred out of our joint account, plus interest ordered by the court. I received 60% of what remained of the marital estate, including the house, based on the court's explicit finding of deliberate asset dissipation and bad faith conduct. The NDA disappeared entirely from the final agreement. I signed nothing that would have kept me quiet. Paternity had already been confirmed through a prenatal test at 14 weeks, arranged quietly through my own doctor once I had insurance of my own again. Nathan was the biological father. That result sat in black and white in the official settlement record, plain proof that he had been wrong from the very first sentence he'd spoken that night in our kitchen. I hope, wherever he keeps that document now, he reads that page slowly. The remainder of Owen's estate finished dispersing over the following year, exactly as Walter Higgins had described, real estate liquidated carefully, investments unwound without rushing the market. Every step handled with the same deliberate patience Owen seemed to have built into every part of that trust. I signed the final divorce papers on a Thursday in early autumn. Nathan didn't look at me once during the signing. Driving home through Charlotte traffic afterward, I felt my daughter move for the first time. A small, unmistakable flutter, like a hand knocking softly on a door from the other side. "I'm here," she seemed to be saying, in the only language available to her yet. "I know," I said back quietly to an empty car. "So am I. Her name is Wren. She was born on a Sunday in late November, 6 pounds 11 ounces, with her father's dark eyes and, according to everyone who meets her, my exact stubbornness. She's 7 months old as I write this, currently making extremely serious observations about her own feet from a bouncer set up beside my desk. We live in a house I bought myself in a quieter part of town, smaller than the old one, with better morning light and a garden I am slowly, happily learning by hand instead of on paper. My design practice has grown. My name is on the door of my own small studio now, 6 clients on the books, a 7th in conversation. That means something to me I still find difficult to fully put into words. Owen's gift changed what's possible for Ren and me, and I don't pretend it didn't. But I've tried hard not to let it change who I actually am underneath it. I still double-check my own drawings before a client ever sees them. I still call my mother every Sunday evening. Nathan's firm went through a difficult stretch the year after our divorce. The settlement required him to liquidate several holdings at a bad moment in the market, and his professional reputation, once the details of the deposition became part of the public record, took a hit he hadn't planned for. He sees Ren on schedule without significant conflict, and he is, whatever else is true, her father. That fact remains true no matter what he did to get there, and I try, imperfectly, on the days I'm still angry, to keep those two truths separate from each other. I haven't spoken to Vivian since she walked out of Priya's apartment with her tin of shortbread. I don't expect that to change, and I've made a kind of peace with that particular silence. Priya got engaged in the spring. I was there, Ren fussing loudly through most of a toast, and Priya still brings it up every chance she gets. Nora visited Charlotte last summer and brought a small box of photographs of Owen from the years I'd never known him in, hiking somewhere green and misty near Mount Rainier, standing on a dock in a yellow rain jacket, laughing at something outside the frame. I was glad, looking through them, that he'd had those years, that whatever quiet life he'd built out west had held some real joy in it. He told me once that you were the most honest person he ever knew, Nora said, handing me the last photo. Structurally honest, he called it. Said you never built anything, in a garden or in a life, on ground you hadn't checked yourself first. I looked at that photograph for a long time before I answered. I tried to be, I said. I still try. Some mornings I sit on my back porch with coffee going cold beside me and think about the sequence of events that carried me here. A kitchen island, a paper bag, a Waffle House parking lot at midnight, a conference room table sliding a phone toward me, a printed email laid down like a winning hand. It didn't feel, while it was happening, like a story with any shape to it at all. It felt like standing inside a structure that was actively coming down around me, with no way to know in advance which walls would hold and which ones were only ever decoration. The walls held. When Ren is old enough to understand, I'll tell her the entire thing, not as a warning, but as a demonstration. Look, I'll say, see what holds when you build it honestly, even under pressure, even when someone you trusted is actively trying to take it apart. If there's one thing this entire ordeal taught me, it's this. The people who try hardest to diminish you are almost always counting on exactly one thing, that you don't fully know your own worth yet. Nathan counted on my fear. Vivian counted on my isolation. They were both wrong about me, and I suspect they'll be wrong about the next woman who refuses to disappear quietly too. Know what you're standing on. Document everything, even when it feels excessive. Find your Priya, and never, under any circumstances, sign away your own voice for someone else's comfort. What would you have done, sitting alone in that parking lot in the middle of the night? Tell me in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear it. If this story moved you tonight, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Kate's Fortune Stories, because there's always another story waiting. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.